I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
I often think of this as a way of the country really becoming unmoored, psychologically unmoored.
Understanding the forces moving our society and culture is essential before trying to create needed change. And this week, we've got expert takes on two important aspects of America 2023. We'll take a dive into some of the disturbing findings of the latest Public Religion Research Institute American Values Survey.
Reagan's biggest success was mainstreaming this evangelical vision to the larger public. Now, when he said shining city on a hill, that meant one thing to religious conservatives. To many secular people, it was a harmless phrase.
And later, the author of a riveting book that examines how the blessing of the religious right gave one president a second term. Writing the American Dream, how the media mainstreamed Reagan's evangelical vision. We are growing the State of Belief, building on our 17-year history by partnering with Religion News Service. And as part of the RNS family of podcasts, there's a next generation, the State of Belief podcast I want to make sure you're subscribed to. Please visit stateofbelief.com/new podcast. It would really help us to have you subscribe and to tell people you're close to about the conversations you are hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can help keep this show on the air is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. Dr. Robert P. Jones is president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute and author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, his third. PRRI is always coming out with invaluable findings on who we are and what we believe as Americans. The 2023 American Values Survey is out, and there's a lot in here to discuss. And so, Robbie, welcome back to the State of Belief.
Thanks, Paul. I'm glad to be here.
Listen, first of all, let me start by saying congratulations on the success of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to Shared American Future. The reviews have been amazing. This is a book that obviously people were hungry for, and so congratulations on the success. New York Times bestselling, really great. I hope our listeners have had a chance to go out and get it and learn about the great research that Robbie has done.
Oh, thanks, Paul. It's been an amazing ride. It seems to have struck a nerve this fall, so it's been great.
Yeah, well, speaking of striking nerves, the American Values Survey, tell us first, what that is, how often it happens, and what kind of research goes into it so we know how the information that we're gathering, where it comes from. What is the American Values Survey?
So the American Values Survey is PRRI's flagship survey. So we do it every fall. This is our 14th annual survey. So we've been doing it for 14 years, and we conduct it every year in partnership with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And our partners there at Brookings, we have the same two kind of senior fellows at Brookings of E.J. Diane Jr., who's also a columnist at the Washington Post, author extraordinaire, and Bill Galston, who's a columnist at the Wall Street Journal. But both are senior fellows at Brookings in the Governance Studies program. They have been our long-term, it's the longest partnership actually that we've had at PRRI. It's been there really since the beginning. So each fall we survey, well over 2,500 Americans, and we ask, essentially, it's really one that's not focused on a single subject, but it is trying to get at what is really happening at this intersection of religion, culture, and politics. So it covers a lot of ground in terms of issues, but we're also trying to get, I think, underneath the kind of what Americans believe to kind of what's driving them. Why do they believe what they believe? And also particularly what role is religion and politics playing in those beliefs?
Yeah. Well, as someone who's like been along the ride with you in some of these processes, I know you're always kind of looking for those statistics that stand out, that make you kind of sit up straight and say, "Oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's surprising." What are some of the headlines that came out of this survey?
Yeah, it is kind of a sifting process, so we ask well over 50 questions. We've got hundreds of ways we could slice the data demographically, by religion, by gender, education, race, ethnicity, party. And so we're kind of looking for the patterns that tell a story about where we are in the country. And there were a few that really stood out this year. One of them is that everybody's concerned about the future of democracy. So I think that's kind of one headline. 3/4 of the country say that the future of American democracy is at stake in the 2024 presidential election. So it's one of the few places, in fact, where we find bipartisan agreement on the ground. So it's 84% of Democrats, but it's also 77% of Republicans who believe the future of democracy is at stake in the 2024 election. The other thing in terms of just general mood, I guess, of the country, it's pretty pessimistic out there. People believe the country's kind of gotten off track. Now there are obviously very different reasons people believe the country's off track, but by and large, it's fairly pessimistic. We have a slim majority of Americans who say America's best days are now behind us. 52% of the country says that. But there's a huge partisan gap on this question, more than 30 points. It's primarily Republicans. And we do sometimes see this, if you're a Republican and there's a Democrat in the White House, we do sometimes see this partisan effect where Republicans are more gloomy if there's a Democrat in the White House. But it's 2/3 of Republicans saying America's best days are behind us, 35% of Democrats saying America's best days are behind us. But in general, even when Trump was in the White House, I think it was largely because Trump was kind of, the American carnage president. He would give speeches talking about how awful things were in America, even while he was in charge.
I think that was his inaugural speech, was on American carnage. It was like, okay, that's pretty good.
So there has been,
all right.
This more doom and gloom among Republicans, I think, as a whole. But I think it's largely because the country on many things is just trending in a direction that the culture is moving in a direction that's not in lockstep, right? So there's, 2/3 of the country supports marriage equality today. 2/3 of the country supports abortion rights today, right? And so I think that's also kind of lending to the kind of doom and gloom among Republicans. It's not just partisanship, but the sense that the country is kind of moving away. Quarter of the country is religiously unaffiliated today. Among young people, it's 4 in 10. Right. And we're no longer a white Christian country, as you and I have talked about before, but just to put the number out there again, today the country is only 42% white and Christian. If you add all of the white Christians up, right, Protestant, Catholic, non-denominational, you still only get to 42%. And just 20 years ago, that number was 54. So they're sensing that, that shift in the country as well.
Right. One of the ones that, at least was the headline for me was the support for violence and political violence. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? That was a kind of a terrifying number, and what seems to be a shift that we've seen. Talk about that statistic.
Yeah, that's right. So the numbers we were talking about before, I think, were kind of the bigger context and kind of mood in the country. But, the finding that we ended up really putting in the spotlight had to do with political violence. And we've been asking a question really since the insurrection. We've been asking about whether people believe that we may have to resort to violence to save the country. So our question the full question wording is an agree or disagree question. We've asked this question 8 times since March of 2021. And it reads like this: because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. When we first asked this question, again, 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, it was 15% of Americans, 15. who agreed with that statement. Again, we've asked this question 8 times. This is the first time that the number has exceeded ever 20%. And we asked this question in our most recent survey is 23% of the country that now says they can, things may have gotten so far off track. True American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. There is also, it has increased across the board, really in most demographic groups, but it is most pronounced on the right. So among Republicans, it is now 1 in 3 Republicans, 33%, who say true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country. It's 13% of Democrats. So it's about 2.5 times the number of Republicans compared to the number of Democrats that say this. And then one other thing we did is, in addition to kind of looking at the kind of ideological and partisan spread on the numbers, is to try to understand what attitudes were connected, to this, to these ideas, so that you can better understand like what's driving people to say we may have to resort to violence to save the country. Once you see that, it becomes pretty clear that the real support for this is really on America's political right and religious right today. So I'll just give you kind of a few of the attitudinal shifts or attitudinal pieces that make you much more likely to say you may have to resort to violence. So if, for example, you believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, that in fact is the single highest our attitude that makes for the single highest support for political violence. If you believe the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, 46% of that group, nearly half of that group, says that we may have to resort to violence in order to save the country, which immediately, of course, brings back those images from January 6th. If you just have a favorable view of Donald Trump, 4 in 10 of that group says we may have to resort to violence. There are 3 other attitudes that are basically 4 in 10. If you held these attitudes, 4 in 10 of that group says you may have to resort to violence to save the country. Here are the 3. Immigrants are invading our country and misplacing our cultural and ethnic background. God intended America to be a new promised land for European Christians. And society as a whole has become too soft and feminine. Each of those, if you agree with each of those statements, 4 in 10 of each of those groups say we may have to resort to violence. And then there's one more that's still above average, and that is if you agree that the killings of Black Americans by police are isolated incidents rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans, 3 in 10 of that group is likely to say that true American patriots may have to resort to violence. So to distill all that down, here are the things that contribute to and are positively correlated with a willingness to kind of resort to political violence: a belief in the big lie, favorable views of Trump, belief in the so-called Great Replacement theory, Christian nationalism, patriarchy, and denials of systemic racism. Like that's basically the formula for those who are more willing to support political violence today.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the terrifying thing here, as you're well aware of, and I think our listeners are very well aware of, is that the correlation between violence and Christian nationalism, unfortunately, is like, this is, and, I'm still kind of, there's some of those interviews that I do, they're like, okay, that's going to sit with me. And talking to Jeff Charlotte about the Great Undertow and scenes from a slow civil war, and about mentioning how many guns were in churches and the kind of rise in the militarization of kind of Christian militia. And it is like, it is, I have to say, this is like a very terrifying, sobering statistic, and I'm not sure exactly what we can do about it. But
I think you're right that we should sit with this one for a bit and not gloss over it. I think it's easy to, hear a statement like, Christian nationalism, or this core belief in Christian nationalism that God intended America to be a kind of promised land for European Christians, right? That's what the question says. So it's whiteness, embedded in the question. It's an attitude, by the way, that a majority of Republicans affirm that statement. A majority of white evangelicals affirm that statement. And it sounds, I think, it's sometimes if you just hear it in the abstract, it sounds maybe just a little, okay, it's dated, it's fringe, or something like that. But again, this view has captured one of our two political parties, and a whole group of mainstream white Christians in the country now has become kind of centered around this idea. And it's not just a metaphor, right?
Right.
Kind of the country as a Christian nation is not just some abstract thing. And if you think about it, and I wrote about this, in the hidden roots of white supremacy. But if you take that seriously, right, and that this is a God ordained end, and this is the way that the country was designed by God to be, then of course, if you really believe that, it does open the door to protecting that vision of the country by any means necessary.
Right. One of the other statistics is about like how people are getting their information, which is very disconcerting. QAnon is to me like, how is this a thing? But it is really a thing. And so like, talk to me about how you do ask about QAnon in this survey. What role is QAnon playing in our body politic?
Yeah, again, this is another thing you think of as being like really fringe, but it is something that, as odd as it is, that it is capturing again a non negligible number of members of the country. I think it is I often think of it this as a way of the country really becoming unmoored, psychologically unmoored in many ways. And I think when we have these demographic shifts we've been talking about, and when the country is shifting away from something I think that many white Christians were so sure it was, that is a white Christian country and would always be this thing, and the country is shifting out from underneath them, I think it does lend itself, it creates a kind of psychological space for these wild theories, anything to explain what's going on. And so we ended up spending way too much time on QAnon message boards and stuff just to kind of get the vibe and reading articles about it. But we ended up coming up with a question to try to capture the core of it. And again, this is a question I never thought I'd really write as a social scientist, but here's the question that we ask people: do they agree or disagree? The government, media, and financial worlds in the U.S. are controlled by a group of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. That's the question. We started asking this after the insurrection in the last election cycle. And we asked that question plus a couple of others. One is the political violence question is part of this battery that we classify people as QAnon believers or rejectors. And then the other question we have is a kind of apocalyptic thing that QAnon has wrapped up in it, that is this idea that there's a storm coming soon that's going to wipe away the current leaders and sweep in, this kind of revolution of new leaders. So this kind of this cocktail of Satan worshiping pedophiles and political violence and kind of apocalypticism that is this, mix, this QAnon. But we asked about that, and 2 years ago, it was 14% of the country that agreed with all three of those statements. Believe it or not, that number's up to 23% today that believes in all. That's a quarter of the country that sort of affirms this sentiment. And again, it's you can see it much more operative on the right. Republicans are twice as likely as Democrats to affirm those statements, and Democrats are 3 times as likely to reject all three of those statements. But it's nearly a third of Republicans who affirm these statements. But I do think it is a kind of just sign, that the country's not well.
I mean, unmoored is a very vivid way to put it. Thank you for that. What do you think this survey means for the election in 2024. Like, it's not great news that people are very pessimistic unless you can figure out a way to speak directly into that. But what are some other things that came up in the survey that you think are going to be really important in 2024?
Yeah. Well, there's very little common ground between Republicans and Democrats. Now, I know that doesn't come as a great surprise. We actually asked a broad battery of issues, and we had 20 issues on the survey, and we asked people to tell us whether they were critical issues or not in the survey. And there was actually only one thing that Republicans and Democrats agreed on, and that was kind of economic pain, that the increasing cost of housing and everyday expenses were a challenge, and people were worried about that. So that one thing holds the country together. But then you do see kind of this very different set of priorities for Democrats and Republicans that are not just economic, they're about kind of cultural things. So, if you look at the top issues for Democrats, they're pretty diverse, actually. But, I'll just list them off. These are the things that had like half or more of Democrats said were critical issues to the country. And you kind of get a feel for it. Climate change, access to guns and gun safety, healthcare, health of our democracy, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, mental health, and abortion. By the way, half of Democrats say abortion is a critical issue. So there's a pretty broad set of things here. There were many fewer issues that Republicans said were critical issue, and you'll hear a very different kind of salience if you listen to these, right? So there's only 5 of them. The things that Republicans say are critical: what children learn in public school, crime, immigration, human trafficking. That's it, right? Wow. So if you kind of get the feel of that, that's all about kind of fear, protection, danger, right? Is what all of those things kind of have in mind. So our kids are getting taught dangerous things in school. We're going to get assaulted by a criminal. Immigrants are pouring over the border. Children are being trafficked. It's all this kind of like world is falling apart and the world's a dangerous place. We hunker down and we fight for, this other vision of America is right there, even in a mundane question like which issues are more important to you. Mm-hmm. So I think to your bigger question, looking in 2024, I think we're just in for a pretty continued bumpy ride. And I'm quite worried about, the violence that we may see at the polls. Even, we saw them after we saw the violence kind of breaking out after the election. But given these numbers and the fact that, again, a majority of one of our 2 political parties is saying, yeah, I could imagine that might be justified, that political violence might be justified because the country's gotten so far off track. It makes me pretty worried about what may happen between, now and this time next year.
I wonder, for those people who said political violence may be justified, do they also say, I'm worried about American democracy? Because if you're justifying political violence, you can't also say I'm worried about American democracy, because actually you are the biggest threat to American democracy. But my guess is that they're worried about American democracy kind of functioning as a tool for getting their way. And if it doesn't work that way, they're willing to turn to violence. But, it is an interesting, in addition to the economic question, that everyone's concerned with American democracy, but what we mean by that concern may be very different.
No, that's exactly right. It's a really important point. And we actually had one question to kind of get at this is we asked a question about whether people would perceive democracy to be broken if either Trump or Biden won the election. And here you see, a really different view. Like, so for Democrats, 72% say if Trump wins the election, it means that democracy is broken and we may need a new form of government. It's interesting though, like 18% of Democrats say that if Joe Biden wins the 2024 election, democracy is broken. But among Republicans, 2/3 of Republicans, 64% of them say if Joe Biden wins the 2024 election, democracy is broken. And again, it's nearly 8 in 10 Republicans who say they're very worried about democracy. So what we see is that, particularly among partisans, there's this view, I think, that even though there's no kind of equivalency here, it's very clear that you can say this without even being partisan. I mean, the evidence on the ground is that sort of that MAGA movement rooted in the Republican Party is very clearly the threat to democracy. It is the thing that tried to overturn a free and fair election. I mean, there's just clear evidence about that. And yet that's not the way Republicans see it.
Mm. So you wrote in your last book about a shared American future. So where do you see that? One of the great things about the book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and a Path to a Shared American Future, was that not only did you talk about just this horrible expressions of white supremacy with Native Americans and Black Americans, but also that there was effort in communities to figure out a way forward together, acknowledging that and moving forward. And yet, when I hear this AVS for short, the American Values Survey, it's very hard in some ways to see a way forward together.
I think that's right. I mean, I think we're in a troubling place, a dangerous place for American democracy. But it's important to remember that, when you just give those partisan numbers, you do see two political parties and partisans really entrenched. But when you look at a number of other things, the country is not really on issues and on a lot of important things in a 50-50 split situation. Now we're at a partisan split that makes it look like that. But kind of go back to this couple numbers I gave at the beginning. 2/3 of the country today, it's 2-1 supports marriage equality for gay and lesbian couples. It's 2-1 in the country that supports basic abortion rights, that say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. It's 2-1 Americans who want to see a comprehensive immigration reform package that would make a path to citizenship for immigrants who are in the country illegally. So on so many of our most vexing issues, we're actually in a 2-1 situation, right? The challenge is that 30%, that 33% that's on the other side, has captured one of the two political parties. And so it has a kind of disproportionate leverage and power. That's true because of gerrymandering at the local level, we're diluting minority votes at the state level. All of that stuff kind of adds up to the Electoral College. I think is another place where this votes of that 30% of Americans, gets amplified in ways that make it look like. So yes, we're deeply divided, and the opinions are very strong. But on even kind of immigration, abortion, LGBTQ rights, like those things that you would say are the most divisive issues in the country, it's not a 50-50 split at all. It's more like a 2-1 split.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's such a good point, and it's so important to remember, I remember we did a survey back a few years ago about the majority of Americans really actually want to live in a religiously diverse country. They celebrate that. And the majority of Americans are glad that we live in a racially diverse country and want more equity, and justice around civil rights issues. And so it is really important to remember these things. When a survey like this comes out, it's like, oh my God, there's just no future together. But actually, there is a future together. And people, I'll just use the marriage equality, issue, that people can change their minds. And we have to remember that people can change their minds. They can. People who were dead fast against it today are absolutely supporting it. And so we have to remember that, people out there who right now feel absolutely oppositional. It is always important to invite an opportunity to imagine a different future for the country and for our community. So I really appreciate you reminding us of that. Dr. Robert P. Jones is president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute and author of 3 influential books: The End of White Christian America, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and his latest, a New York Times bestseller titled The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Robbie, thank you so much for being with us on The State of Belief.
Thanks, Paul. Always glad to be here.
Up next, Diane Winston. Her latest book is titled Writing the American Dream: How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. And make sure you subscribe to the Next Generation podcast at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. That's stateofbelief.com/new podcast. You're listening to State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Caitlin Beatty.
Saved by the City is a podcast from 2 Christian women cracking the code of faith from the mean streets of New York City.
Our podcast captures what happens when purity culture meets hookup culture, when distraction steals from devotion, and when the diversity of viewpoints and lifestyles clash against assumptions.
Gotham can be a weird place for Christian women, but we're out there, and we have stories to tell.
Saved by the City, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
My next guest is both a scholar and a practitioner. Having spent a decade as a working journalist, Diane Winston is now Associate Professor of Journalism and the Knight Chair on Media and Religion at the University of Southern California. With a PhD from Princeton University in Religion and a master's degree from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and Harvard Divinity School, Diane has the credentials to unravel a story as complex as the one this book examines, and then some. The book is Writing the American Dream: How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision. Diane Winston, welcome to the State of Belief.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for having me today.
I want to make sure that people hear it. When I say writing the American dream, it's an R. It could be a WR, but in this case, it's an R. So if you're looking for it on Amazon or wherever, or your local bookstore, even better, that it starts with an R. Writing the American Dream: How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision. I will tell you that if you read this book, you will be smarter. Like, it's that simple. Like, it is such an incredibly researched, beautifully written, understandable, yet complex issues, complex concepts. And so I just really, really appreciate it. Now, what was the spark for this book? Because there had to be something where you just said, aha, like, this is a connection that no one has made. And truly, for me, as someone who's been around the block a while, I had never made this connection. You made a connection. What was the spark that made you say, I have to write this book?
When Obama was elected in 2008, it occurred to me that we were on the brink of a large change in our country's vision. I thought that Obama was bringing in a new day, a new era, where there would be less individualism, less focus on the market, a more open and loving political community. And because he often used the language of religion in his speeches, and because the media had been so central, so instrumental in bringing his message to the people, I began thinking that this would be a time to look at how religion and media affect how we think about ourselves as individuals and as citizens of the United States. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. I wrote the book slowly because as a professor, I'm teaching, I'm doing committees. I know people think we sit around and eat bonbons, but most of the time during the school year, I'm pretty hard at work. So in 2016, when Trump was elected, I realized not only had our American vision not changed for the better, it was about to change, in my opinion, for the worse. And so the book took on a totally different sense of urgency and importance as I wrote it, because I wanted to figure out how Reagan, who I say was the last president to give us a new American vision, how Reagan could possibly lead to Trump.
One of the phrases that you came up with, which I had never heard before, is religious imaginary, which you describe as a religious imaginary expresses a commonsensical collective understanding of what matters and why. Can you talk a little bit more about a religious imaginary and what that really means and why it's so central to the thesis of this book, and understanding really some of what has driven America over the last, almost 40 years?
Right. A religious imaginary is a constellation of ideas and images that reflect metaphysical truths, that reflect ethical norms, moral concerns that are usually not verbalized or articulated. It's more a sense of it's more a sense of understanding something in your gut. So, for example, if I say America is a shining city on a hill, that resonates with people because they've heard this phrase, and in their minds, they're thinking, we're a shining city on a hill. God blessed us. We have God's blessings. We're going to live out those blessings in the world. So what I suggest is there's one large religious imaginary that is kind of based on the Puritan ideas that God blesses America, and so we're all blessed. But there also are different religious imaginaries that we all live with. So Martin Luther King's beloved community is a religious imaginary that has kept the Black community together. And the Golden Land was a religious imaginary of Jews who came here in the early 20th century. Robert Bellah talks about civil religion, which is another kind of imaginary that speaks to secular people. So there are many religious imaginaries, but what I suggest is most Americans also understand and respond to this larger idea of the shining city on a hill, American exceptionalism.
Right. Well, and you write that, I'm going to be quoting you quite a bit, and I hope that's okay. But it's so good. The Reaganite religious imaginary rested on two convictions that were part of a conservative Protestant worldview. America is an exceptional country because it is God's chosen nation. And God wants Americans to be free. Those two things. I mean, that's very powerful. It's clear, it's understandable. For you, that was like Reagan's religious imaginary that he was offering to the people. And I just was like, oh, that's so clear. And like, it's so easy to respond to, which I think was part of the attraction. Say more about that.
Reagan had the gift of taking complex ideas and boiling them down into phrases and words that people could understand. So the shining city on a hill. Actually, it's not a shining city on a hill. In the actual sermon, it's a city on a hill. And it meant that America would be judged by the world as to whether or not it kept its promise to be faithful to God. It wasn't a, benediction of our holiness. It was almost the opposite. It was challenging us. Reagan added the word shining, and it changed from this idea that we are being judged by our fellow humans to this idea that we are blessed and above our fellow humans. And that one little word made such a difference, and it was so powerful. And that's the kind of gift Reagan had. He was able to make a complex idea available to the larger public.
Right, right. And one of the central thesis of this book, in addition to identifying that and the myriad of ways that Reagan exercised this during his presidency and the run up to his presidency, was the role that media played in helping this become mainstreamed so that it became almost obvious that
Right.
these things were true and that these things could be understood, and that, and that one person had that mouthpiece. And talk to me about that, because you are a professional around media studies. I mean, not, media writ large, and someone who spent a lifetime in some ways in journalism. And yet you write this book that's really in some ways an indictment of journalism in that moment, becoming a mouthpiece almost for this religious imaginary that really led to the rise of Reagan and the way we understand Reagan still. I mean, Reagan has become mythologized as this like amazing moment. And, Republicans look back, oh, a Reagan Republican, whatever that means. And so, but talk to me about your understanding of the role that media played in sharing this religious imaginary of God as an exceptional country because it is God's chosen nation, and that God wants Americans to be free.
Reagan's biggest success, or one of his biggest successes, was mainstreaming this evangelical vision to the larger public. Now, when he said shining city on a hill, that meant one thing to religious conservatives. To many secular people, it was a harmless phrase. And in that way, the media helped circulate the message. He did this all the time. So I talk about to start with the Evil Empire speech that he gave to the National Association of Evangelicals in March of 1983, where he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Reagan felt communism was an existential evil because it opposed the basic freedoms that America treasured: freedom and democracy, free markets, and religious freedom. And so it was more than this is our political enemy. This is Satan threatening our life and our destiny. And when he used those terms, many reporters backed away from it because, as you know, Paul, many journalists don't know what to do with religion. Either they stay away from it, or they, lampoon it, or they sensationalize it, but usually they don't sensitively try to unpack it. Even though reporters didn't pay much attention to this evil empire idea, pundits picked it up, and they talked about the evil empire, and they talked about how crazy it was. And even in talking about how crazy it is, they still mainstream the idea, because even if media doesn't tell us what to think, it tells us what to think about.
Right.
And so even if you and I do not believe in an evil empire, if we keep reading about it, it normalizes it.
I remember that moment. I was young. I mean, I don't even know how. I mean, I was in my teens still, and that phrase still rings in my mind. The evil empire. We heard about it over and over and over again. And you do such an amazing job in that moment in the book, because you outline the reporters heard one thing. He gave that speech to an evangelical audience. They heard a whole other thing that was going on underneath it. And so there was all sorts of different things going on in different levels. And the context mattered so much because, as you point out in this great book, Writing the American Dream, How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision, you write about this was done in the context of the incredibly popular freeze movement, the freezing of nuclear weapons. And so when he was doing this, it wasn't just like, I'm just going to make a speech. He was really trying to kneecap the freeze movement, which was incredibly popular with all people, including religious people, and was often driven by religious people. And it was a moment when he actually was able to neutralize the freeze movement in some ways and continues spending so much money on nuclear weapons. And it became like this is an existential battle. And for many, it was a spiritual battle. And that's what they heard. And that's what matters. And that's just incredibly important history to remember. And for those of us who lived in that time, that phrase still rings out as something that was a moment in American kind of, I think it is in religious imaginary, in like our understanding, like we are up against this, and the idea of empire, like Satan's empire. There's lots of ways that resonates in an imaginary, as you so beautifully put out.
My favorite example of this is in the October 16th issue of the New Yorker. There's an interview with Jake Sullivan, who's head of the NSA. Sullivan is obviously a Democrat. He's a Biden appointee. And in the interview, he's asked why he's been so strong on supporting the war in Ukraine, why he thinks it's central. And he says, I grew up in the 80s. I grew up with Rocky and Rambo, believing there's good and bad in the world. And Ukraine is a fight for the good. I don't think Sullivan knows he was channeling Reagan. Obviously, they're from two political parties that are very different. And yet this is what Reagan was about. And this is what I mean by mainstreaming a religious imaginary, because it does carry down to today.
Right. And the other thing that it's really important to remember in that time is, and certainly I remember this very clearly, that there were just the idea of the power of the newspaper, the power of the three media, main TV stations, ABC, NBC, CBS, the fact that I can list them. Now, you could spend the entire podcast just naming the different, cable news channels out there. There was a way that people could completely frame what was important, as you said, what people should be thinking about. And they had so much power about like what to cover, how to cover it, where to put it on the priority list, where it fell on the paper. Above the fold is still something we said when in my whole history was in the digital journalism, we still said above the fold when we meant something was important. Right. And so the idea of journalists at that time, especially having so much power to do something. You mentioned that a lot of this wasn't done certainly intentionally. It was just done because in some ways Reagan was such a good communicator that they just followed his lead. Is that right? Or tell me, nuance that a little bit. That wasn't exactly it, but
it was several things. It was partly a reaction to the crusading journalism of the 1970s. When a lot of newspapers were taking down big corporations. It was partly about the sort of news fatigue because there had been so much bad news throughout the 70s. It was partly about the impact of USA Today, light, bright, colorful. Right. All these changes in the news business made reporters softer on Reagan than they had been on either Jimmy Carter or Gerald Ford or Richard Nixon. It made reporters more open to this idea of this kindly former Hollywood actor, maybe we take him seriously, maybe we give him a pass. So the news industry was at a point where Reagan's message was picked up and circulated without that much critical attention. But it also reflected Reagan's ability to shape narratives in the way he wanted. So the Evil Empire speech in March resonates in October when there's a communist coup in Grenada. And even though Grenada is a very tiny little nation in the Caribbean, Reagan decides it's time to go in there and drive out the communists. And he framed this invasion of a tiny Caribbean nation as a fight against communism. And the beauty of it was that when American forces went in, he banned the press from following them. It was the first time since the mid-19th century that the press was not allowed to go and cover the war. That was done intentionally because a lot of people in the administration believed that reporters had lost the war in Vietnam. And the administration wanted to control the story of how we crushed communism in Grenada. And they did that by putting out stories about large supplies of weapons and thousands of soldiers and terrible fighting. And that circulated in the media for several days before actual reporters went in and wrote stories that belied all the previous reporting. There were no great caches of military weapons. There were not thousands of soldiers. This was a tiny little nation. Yet, because Reagan's story was out there, because it fed the imaginary, and because it restored American sense of greatness and strength and spreading democracy, a feeling that had been shattered by our defeat in Vietnam, it resonated. So Reagan was able to control the narrative not only by being very smart about what he said, but also by controlling the press, which is a great example.
Yeah. Well, the other example that just really resonated with me was when AIDS became prevalent, and the framing, and basically maybe you can explain it. He kind of outsourced in a way.
Yeah, that's a great word for it.
His mouthpiece to Jerry Falwell, and allowed Jerry Falwell to frame what AIDS was for the White House, and which was, as someone who was, coming out as gay during that time, how devastating all of this was. This framing of this as a gay plague, which allowed, a certain kind of reaction, and whether or not it was important enough to deal with. But Reagan's inaction on that is still something that if you talk to people of my age, we still can't forgive him for how that was. And we can't forgive Jerry Falwell for the way it was framed, and that it was God's punishment. These were all things that, and when we talk about religious imaginary, I mean, there were many religious leaders who were just like outraged by this because they were actually caring for people who were dying. And they were like trying to, you mentioned William Sloane Coffin, who was saying this is not God's punishment. This is a disease. But it was out there. And even gay men were starting to think, okay, this is what happened to me. Right. And that's how powerful this stuff is. And so, I mean, talk a little bit about like the role of the major evangelical leaders, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, others who really were playing, feeding this stuff and framing in some ways religion for America. What is the religious voice of America? Well, there it is. It's Pat Robertson. It's Jerry Falwell. We have them.
Yes, and exactly. And that was a confluence of the televangelists' media savvy and the media's obtuseness. Their refusal to take religion seriously drove them to quote folks who were giving good quote and who had very extremist views. As you say, Falwell became the surrogate for Reagan. Reagan was told by his advisors, don't say anything about AIDS. You're going to lose people, whatever you say. And so he kept quiet for a long time. And because Americans knew that he was close to people like Falwell, because they often appeared together and Falwell claimed credit for Reagan's victory, the media began turning to Falwell for quotes from religious leaders. And they began framing AIDS stories in Falwell's terms. So what really knocked me out was a story that was in Newsweek that summer of '83 that basically was written to explain to the public who gays were and what this was about. I think Newsweek intended it to be a positive or at least a neutral story. And yet the subheads were all Falwellian, punishment, discipline, payback, things like that. So even a story that was meant to be positive or at least neutral, came out as harsh and, in this terrible language of guilt and
Yeah.
shame.
It totally reconfirmed the whole frame that was, really harmful and psychologically damaging, but also policy. It drove policy.
I really think it changed sort of the trajectory of the gay community in America, insofar as many in that community saw themselves as countercultural in terms of family life, in terms of where they fit into the structure. And that one of the impacts of AIDS was to normalize gayness by seeking marriage equality and by fitting in. I don't know if those issues would have been as important to the community if the community hadn't wanted to see normal in the ideas of Americans.
Yeah, that was often discussed, and certainly it put the lives of gay people more front and center,
Right.
and humanized it. And when you had people like Princess Diana, going and really talking to people with AIDS and others, it did bring them into the main line, but unfortunately into a certain glaring light, which even going on to 9/11, where the first reaction of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson was like, this was the reason this happened, was again, that we were out of favor with God. And so that we were being harmed. And I want to read like an amazing. I had not heard this, but this is in 1980, and you write, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan ran for president, he vowed, quote, "For those who've abandoned hope, we'll restore hope, and will welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again." I had never heard that quote and what has become. And so what Reagan was, and you do a really interesting job of kind of translating how Reagan and his use of the press, how it translates to Donald Trump's use of the press, and how it intersects with both of their use of faith. I'm not in a position to judge, but the idea of like Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump as paradigms of faithful witness is really a questionable one. And yet they both managed to catch the kind of most vocal, vivid, loudest faith voice, which was the white Protestant evangelical voice. So talk to me a little bit about how you see what happened with Reagan with the press and his religious imaginary through the Obama years. I mean, we had some other steps there, but through the Obama years and into what we're experiencing today with Donald Trump.
Reagan's idea of freedom had three basic points: democracy, free markets, and religious liberty. Religious liberty being the freedom to have your religious beliefs in public, which is to say, if you don't want to serve gay people, you don't have to serve gay people. So these I say, took the country from the more FDR tradition of communitarianism and social gospel and a liberal welfare state to more of what we call a market-driven, hyper-individualistic, consumer-oriented country. So that was the paradigm shift. And what I suggest is that, first of all, I believe that Ronald Reagan was a sincere Christian. I believe he did believe in a lot of what he said. I don't think he was fooling anybody. I don't think reporters at the time understood that because he didn't go to church. So obviously he wasn't a real Christian. But that's really not a metric for belief and sincerity. So I believe that when Ronald Reagan cut welfare because he believed in personal responsibility, he was not only interested in the ability to cut taxes, but he also believed people on welfare should get a job because that's what God wanted them to do. Now, you could also say that what he did was to sacralize selfishness and self-aggrandizement and hyper-individualism. I don't think Reagan would have necessarily put it in those words, but Trump did. And I think Trump is sort of the, apotheosis of all of Reagan's ideas gone rogue. So I wouldn't say Trump believed in freedom. I wouldn't say, he believes in autocracy. He believes in getting as much as he can for himself. Ironically, Trump was elected, or his election was driven by white evangelicals who, ever since the age of Reagan, felt their social agenda had not been fulfilled. And so they were angry. Every Republican president let them down. And they decided Trump wouldn't. And he delivered for them. And that transactional relationship basically helped him become president. I don't think Trump has a religious core. I don't think he has religious convictions. I think he has cynically manipulated folks who wanted to believe their agenda was important and could impact the country. And so we have a stacked Supreme Court. We have the repeal of Roe versus Wade. We have Supreme Court cases about whether, gay people should be served, what to do about transgender kids. All of this is the religious rights agenda coming to fruition.
Yeah, if I can just end this with, I want to read your ending of the book, which I thought was so beautiful and sobering. These are the words of Diane Winston in her book, Writing the American Dream: How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision. The book of Proverbs tells us, without a vision, the people perish. But what if a vision causes the people to perish? After 4 decades of Reagan's vision, which animated greed and hyper-individualism in ways that he may not have foreseen, we are faced with a debilitating climate change, increased economic insecurity, systemic racism, and a new class of global oligarchs beholden to no one. White supremacists and Christian nationalists have emerged from the shadows, and anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other instances of ethnic and religious prejudices are on the rise. In such circumstances, Americans need a new vision. Writing the history of that imaginary with what will be a new and, it is hoped, redeemed interplay of religion and politics will be a task for future researchers. Diane Winston, I hope you're around actually to write it, and I hope that we're around to see it. So thank you. Diane Winston spent over a decade as a journalist and is now Associate Professor of Journalism and Knight Chair of Media and Religion at the University of Southern California. She is the author or editor of several books, including Red Hot and Righteous, The Urban Religion of the Salvation Army. Her latest is titled Writing the American Dream: How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision. Diane, thank you so much for being with us today on The State of Belief.
Oh, thank you, Paul. It was so fun to talk with you.
And that's all the time we have for The State of Belief this week. Please be sure to subscribe to the new and improved podcast called The State of Belief at Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. Subscribe to The State of Belief today. We need your help keeping The State of Belief going. I hope you consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And if you're getting something out of this show, share it with your friends and family. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going when the show is over. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at State of Belief and share State of Belief with the people in your networks. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week for a show with Buddhist teacher Sharon Salzberg and Hindu pundit Sushma Dwivedi, who will share the light and wisdom of Diwali. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.